The year was 1955. The world was in the heat of the Cold War, but Southeast Asia burned with an even more brutal war. This war was none other than the Vietnam War. What had initially started as merely a chess game between the superpowers would eventually become a deadly struggle for the soul of Vietnam. It would shatter the nation of Vietnam, fill the jungles with blood, divide the American populace, and eventually cost the lives of over 3 million people. The unthinkable would also happen: a U.S. defeat. But how did this happen? How did a simple tussle lead to a bloody war that lasted for over 2 decades? To find out, we'll have to go to the very beginning. In 2879 BCE, long before the devastating war, Vietnam was a land covered in lush, green forests and rivers. This land was tucked in the easternmost part of the Indochinese peninsula. It was bordered by China's towering mountains in the north, Laos and Cambodia to the west, and the South China Sea to the east. Vietnamese legends say that the land was ruled by a great emperor, Emperor Hung Vuong. Emperor Hung ruled the Vietnamese, and under his rule, they discovered the secrets of wet rice agriculture. It was also under his rule that the people began to master the production of bronze tools. Emperor Hung and his descendants ruled over the Vietnamese for a long time, and were the ones who laid the foundations of Vietnamese civilization. But this peace would not last forever. By 257 BCE, a Chinese general by the name of Thuc Phan marched into Vietnam and overthrew the last Hung king. Thuc Phan started to unite the Vietnam tribes into a kingdom and established Co La Citadel as its capital. Being a Chinese general, he indulged in trade between China and Vietnam, expanding the borders. But even Thuc Phan wouldn't reign forever. A storm was brewing, and he would soon be caught in it. By 111 BCE, 2 sisters known as Trung Trac and Trung Ni started a rebellion. This rebellion, like a flame, spread across the whole of Vietnam. These 2 women led an army that became a revolution, taking back Vietnam from the Chinese. However, China would not take this lying down. To claim back Vietnam, they sent several generals and troops. Vietnam fought, but the sisters were tragically murdered, and once again, Vietnam fell under Chinese rule. This rule lasted for almost 1,000 years until 938 CE. During this period, the Han rulers imposed Chinese culture on the Vietnamese. They wanted the Vietnamese to adopt their customs, their laws, and even their religions like Buddhism and Taoism.
Near Hoi An in central Vietnam, My Son Sanctuary is one of the most significant Hindu temples.
However, the Vietnamese resisted. Revolts were springing up across the nation, with several structures being set on fire. Worried, the Chinese sent another Han general, Ma Yuan, to put an end to these uprisings, but the Vietnamese couldn't be controlled. They had a hero, a brave Vietnamese general named Ngo Quyen. He led the Vietnamese to battle, eventually leading them to the Dong River in the Battle of Bac, where he defeated the Chinese Han dynasty. This victory brought Vietnam independence and started Ngo's dynasty. But independence didn't solve everything. Ngo's dynasty would eventually be overthrown by another Vietnamese known as Dinh Bo Linh in 968 CE. Dinh Bo Linh was a man with a different mind who had one goal: to unify Vietnam. He introduced a truly imperial system and made the capital of the state, Hoa Lu. He also began to plant seeds of Buddhism, but just when this dynasty was getting settled in, Dinh Bo Linh was assassinated in 979 CE, and in came the Lai dynasty, Lai Tai. To had his agenda, he wanted to unify Vietnam under a common culture. So as soon as he got on the throne, he moved the capital to Thang Long. Under this dynasty, Vietnam prospered. For the first time in history, the Vietnamese were adopting a religion, Buddhism, and increasing their territory. Little by little, this dynasty helped shape Vietnam's borders into those of modern-day Vietnam. And just when you thought Vietnam would have peace, internal conflicts started brewing, and the Tran family overthrew the Lai dynasty in 1225 CE. The Tran dynasty was powerful. They proved they were worthy of being Vietnamese rulers by passing almost impossible tests. They managed to strengthen national unity and fend off 3 invasions by the Mongolians, but that was not enough. By 1400 CE, they were overthrown by the Ho dynasty. Ho Quai Liai probably thought he would be much luckier and attempted reforms. However, this was not to be. The Vietnamese resisted his rule, and while he managed to deal with inside attacks, he was unable to fight external ones. He was eventually overthrown by the Chinese Ming, barely 7 years into his reign. The Chinese were back, despite their return. They didn't have the time to drop their bags. Vietnamese forces resisted their return and successfully chased them out once again by 1427 CE. This pursuit was led by another national hero, known by the name of Le Loi. Like Ngo, he started the Le dynasty as Vietnam regained its independence. However, by 1527, Vietnam once again fell into chaos. The Mac family led a coup and kicked the Le dynasty out of the throne. But even they wouldn't last long. Right from when Mac Dang Dung took power, he began a battle with rivals loyal to the Le dynasty. He was overthrown by these forces, and Vietnam was in utter chaos. Revolution broke across the country, with several leaders sprouting across the state. The Nguyen lords in the south and the Trinh lords in the north. Vietnam was torn and in a crisis. It was this crisis that opened the doors of Vietnam to even bigger problems than they could have imagined: foreign invaders from Europe. You see, these foreign invaders didn't come with guns blowing at first. Initially, they had come holding Bibles as missionaries and with promises of trade. But this was thick in the time of European imperialism, and European nations were scrambling to establish colonies across the globe. It was at this period that France set its eyes on Southeast Asia, most especially in Vietnam. Though the French had come to Vietnam as traders and missionaries, they arrived to find the Nguyen lords and the Trinh lords locked in battle. Vietnam was in chaos. The French saw this as a prime opportunity and took their chance. They quickly set up the French Catholic Church and began converting the people to Christianity. The Vietnamese lords wouldn't stop fighting, and back at home, France was thirsty for colonies. With this gap, the French decided this was a chance to take control. In 1858, something happened that would change Vietnam forever. In 1858, a man called Napoleon III led the France invasion of Vietnam.
Returns to its colony of Indochina to bring it back into the fold of the French Empire. But the Vietnamese Communist
They launched an attack on Da Nang in a fight to claim Vietnam. However, the Vietnamese were not going to take it lying down. They rallied their forces and fought the French. This fight lasted for almost 4 years. But the Vietnamese were ill-prepared and weary from their endless tussle of many years. By 1862, France had their first victory. They captured the city of Saigon and forced Tu Duc, the Vietnamese emperor, to sign a treaty. This treaty would hand over all the southern states of Vietnam to the French. It was known as the Treaty of Saigon. This was the beginning of French rule in Vietnam. However, France had eyes on more than Vietnam. Britain, another European superpower, controlled India and Burma. France needed to solidify their control in South Asia and also to create a buffer zone between them and the British colonies, so they also wanted to capture Vietnam's neighbors Laos and Cambodia. Napoleon III was also very interested in the resources of these regions. He wanted control of Cambodia's rubber, Laos's minerals, and Vietnam's rice. So he wasn't content with just southern Vietnam. He led the French troops to conquer Tonkin, which was in northern Vietnam, and Annam in central Vietnam. They would also conquer Vietnamese neighbors, Cambodia and Laos. All three were joined together into French Indochina in 1887. While the French celebrated their success, something interesting was happening among the Vietnamese people. Like the Chinese, France also tried to replace Vietnamese culture with French culture. First, they made Saigon the crown of Indochina, where all the French elites lived. Then, They started building European-style buildings and filling the market with luxury goods. But this wasn't the only problem. Vietnamese farmers were forced to grow rice and work ruthlessly every day, only to see their grains set off in the French trade. Despite their hard labor, they still paid heavy taxes and lost their land. Soon, the people went past just mumbling about the cruelty of the French government and began to plan a resistance. Revolts sprang up across the state, but every time they tried, the French government was quick to squash those attempts. Until one man sprung up. He was the only man who could cause real change. That man was Ho Chí Minh. Ho Chí Minh was born during the French rule in Vietnam. From a young age, he saw how his people suffered under the French. He was constantly plagued by these thoughts. When he attended the National Academy in Hue, he spoke up against the French in Indochina, and he was expelled. But that didn't quench his desire for knowledge or his dream of an independent Vietnam, one that was free from French colonial rule. After being expelled, Ho Chí Minh spent his time traveling the world and ended up visiting the United States and even living in Paris. By the end of World War I, Ho Chí Minh was excited about the Versailles Peace Conference. He saw it as a chance to bring forward the suffering of his people back at home. He was even more excited about sending his petition to U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. This was because the U.S. president had championed self-determination in the past. When Ho Chí Minh was allowed to speak, he passionately demanded rights for the Vietnamese. He called for freedom of the press, the release of prisoners held by the French, and that Vietnam be given the right to independence. However, Ho Chí Minh was met with disappointment. Not only was he ignored by France, but he was also ignored by Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson at the time was reluctant to offend France. It was at this point that he realized he would have to look for other means to free his people, no matter how drastic they could be. From then on, Ho Chí Minh became radicalized. Realizing that help would not come from the West, he began to focus on communist ideologies and ideas. He went back home, but he was far from defeated. Upon returning, he found his people even more repressed than he left them. This caused him to start a nationalist movement to bring the Vietnamese together against the French government. He started a party known as the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which would later become the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930. The Indochinese Communist Party was a group of other people who thought like Ho. It was made up of workers, farmers, and other intellectuals who all wanted to free Vietnam from French colonial rule. With this party, Ho Chí Minh called for independence. He asked the Vietnamese to take on weapons, as this was the only way they could free themselves. While he tried, he was still unable to fully fight the French forces. However, by 1940, the world outside of Vietnam was burning. The Second World War had begun. France moved most of their focus to Germany, but before the Vietnamese could even celebrate, Japan had already spotted the opportunity. Taking advantage of a distracted France, they invaded Vietnam and took over. However, even though they installed a regime, this regime was still very controlled by France. But Ho Chí Minh wasn't sitting down with his arms folded. He wasn't going to watch yet another country oppress his people. He had to come up with a plan. Even though he had the ICP and the members of his party were determined, they were small and would not be able to defeat the French. He needed the support of the people. So, the following year, 1931, he did something remarkable. He formed a coalition of both the communist members of his party and the Vietnamese nationals. This coalition was known as the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh had one goal. This goal was to bring every Vietnamese person, irrespective of their beliefs, together to fight against foreign rule. Now remember that while all of this was happening, France was fighting World War II. They had no time for whatever was happening in Vietnam. The Viet Minh saw this distraction and began the struggle to win people over and start a resistance against the Japanese and the French. Ho Chí Minh led this group to begin their fight using guerrilla tactics. These were small, fast, and highly coordinated strikes against Japanese forces. He also had generals like Vo Nguyen Giap, who joined him in leading these guerrilla tactics against the Japanese. These attacks were known as the August Revolution of 1945. By September, something thought unimaginable happened. The World War was ending, and Japan was no longer strong enough to hold on to Vietnam. Noticing their weakness, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh intensified their efforts and eventually took control of Hanoi. On the 2nd of September, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood in front of a massive crowd in Ba Dinh Square and declared Vietnam's independence. He paraphrased the Declaration of the United States, saying all men were created equal, and called for the Vietnamese right to freedom and self-determination. The people celebrated Ho Chi Minh. He had become a national hero. However, this joy wouldn't last long as France had other plans. As World War II came to an end, they returned to take control of their prized colony, only to find that Vietnam had declared itself free of colonial rule. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh refused to let go of this independence and stood up to the French forces. However, by December 1946, France had enough and decided to take back the colony by force. They marched in Haiphong with tens of thousands of soldiers and military tanks, taking the standoff into a full-blown war. This attack at Haiphong left over 2,000 Vietnamese killed. The French army grew to 190,000 soldiers. These soldiers weren't just French forces. They were also part of their colonial troops from Senegal and North Africa. After the attack at Haiphong, using their modern weapons and artillery, including air support, they were able to also take over major cities in Vietnam, like Hanoi and Saigon. Their goal was to completely crush the Viet Minh. Back on the global stage, tensions arose over colonial controls. However, the West, including the United States, noticed that Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam were getting support from communist states like China and the Soviet Union. They then decided it was best Vietnam was under French colonialism than left to the Red Bandits. The Viet Minh was greatly outnumbered. In total, Ho Chi Minh and his troops were about 50,000 in number. However, these men weren't all soldiers. The majority of them were ordinary villagers and farmers who didn't exactly know how to fight. The only thing they knew was that they wouldn't give up Vietnam to the French forces again. One of Ho Chi Minh's generals, Vo Nguyen Giap, was a man who, like Ho Chi Minh, was also well-read. He had traveled to Europe and had learned several warfare tactics. Seeing that they were outnumbered and not very skilled, Vo Nguyen Giap knew they could not defeat the French in conventional warfare. So, he led the Viet Minh groups as they attacked using guerrilla warfare. They would use hit-and-run tactics on the French forces, leaving them constantly confused and on the edge. His goal was to wear them down before even considering matching them head-on. The Viet Minh troops would hide in the bushes and ambush French patrols. They would sabotage supply lines, and just when the French troops thought they could breathe a sigh of relief, the Viet Minh would attack again. These strikes were always hard, fast, and disastrous for the French forces. They hadn't been prepared for this sort of warfare. The French had greatly underestimated the bravery of the Vietnamese people and planned one-and-done warfare. However, Vietnam had rugged terrain, dense forests, and mountains, and this only helped the Vietnamese. Vo Nguyen Giap knew this terrain and was able to lead his troops to attack and disappear into the night. Ho Chi Minh, on the other hand, knew they needed more numbers and had to win the minds of the people, so he was involved in propaganda campaigns. He preached against colonialism and encouraged the people to join in the fight for an independent Vietnam. The Viet Minh sent out pamphlets, used posters, and even held rallies to win people over. Also, whenever the Viet Minh were able to take control of a territory during the war, they would take lands from wealthy landlords and give them to the poor peasants. These actions greatly increased their popularity among the Vietnamese peasants who had suffered under French and Japanese rule. By the late 1940s, the majority of the people were fully behind the Viet Minh. However, the support of the people was not enough. Ho Chi Minh knew that they needed allies and external support, so he looked to Indochina's neighbor, China. You see, in 1949, the People's Republic of China gained independence. The following year, China recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and Ho Chí Minh. China had established a communist government and was more favorable towards the communist-leaning Viet Minh than the French troops. By April 1950, Ho Chí Minh asked China for military aid, and they answered. They sent over weapons and logical support. They used the mountains of North Vietnam, in Lao Cai and Lang Son, to send these weapons and support. They used the Lao Cai route to send military supplies, while Lang Son was great for the movement of troops. Noticing the lack of military knowledge among the Viet Minh troops, they also sent military advisors. These advisors formed the Chinese Military Advisory Group. By September of that year, China had sent thousands of rifles, artillery, and guns to Viet Minh. This made them stronger against the French forces. China also protected the Vietnamese north. But as China supported France, the French weren't the only ones panicking. The United States was also starting to get worried. You see, when the war first started, the Americans were slightly sympathetic towards Vietnamese efforts for independence. However, by 1950, the Cold War had already begun, and they saw Vietnam getting support from communist sides. They were afraid that if Vietnam fell to communism, then all of Southeast Asia would fall too. So, they finally decided to listen to the pleas of the French for support. President Harry Truman, the then President of the United States, approved the sum of $15 million to help France beat the Viet Minh. They also continued granting more support as the war dragged on. However, now that Ho Chí Minh and the Viet Minh army had Chinese assistance, their troops grew to almost 100,000 soldiers. In that same year, they were able to launch a major attack in the north. They targeted French posts along the China border. Using more intense guerrilla tactics, they were able to force the French to retreat. This victory spread joy among the Viet Minh and the Vietnamese. It also solidified their support for China, but it was only the beginning. Everything was already starting to change. The Viet Minh began to regain several parts of Vietnam, including Hoa Binh, located in the west of Hanoi. The following year, France launched an attack on Hoa Binh. Very frustrated with fighting enemies they couldn't see or expect, they were hoping that they could draw Ho Chí Minh and his forces out into a one-on-one battle. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Giap led the Viet Minh forces to break through French lines and surround the French forces instead. Talk about an Uno reverse card. They refused to indulge in direct contact, and France eventually cowered and retreated. Once again, the Viet Minh had proved they could win the battle of attrition. The war continued to drag on, and while both sides suffered, no one was able to claim victory. However, merely 2 years later, in 1954, something happened that would change the course of the First Indochina War. The French made a deadly mistake. The mistake started in 1953 with a man named General Henri Navarre. General Henri was the leader of the French High Command. In late 1953, Navarre came up with an idea to establish a French military stronghold at Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu was a remote valley near the Vietnamese border with Laos. His big plan was that if they had the command there, they would be able to cut off the supply lines from Vietnam to Laos. It would also be a great spot to launch an attack against the Viet Minh. So, they began the creation of this base. General Navarre made sure this case was fortified with airstrips and that they could resupply from the air. He was convinced that the French army had more weapons and, with air support, they would be able to defeat any Viet Minh attack. This would help them control the region. He couldn't have been more mistaken. Leading the Viet Minh forces was General Vo Nguyen Giap, a man General Navarre should have never underestimated. General Giap noticed the location of the French base in Dien Bien Phu, and instead of seeing a threat, he saw a massive opportunity. He immediately gathered about 40,000 troops, and they began to surround the base and cut off all the land supply routes to the valley. The French base was under siege, but General Giap knew that was not enough. Using impressive logistics, he and the Viet Minh forces were able to move heavy artillery through the rugged terrain of the valley. They dragged this artillery through the jungle and placed them on the mountains surrounding the base. General Giap knew that if they could position themselves on the high ground overlooking the valley, they would have the French base surrounded both on the ground and above. This would give them an advantage as they would be able to bombard the French troops from above and below. By March 13, 1954, General Giap and his troops were ready. They launched an attack on Dien Bien Phu, and it was the beginning of an intense fight. The French were surrounded by endless artillery fire from above and relentless attacks from land. The siege lasted for 56 days, with the Viet Minh attacking both day and night. They used a combination of conventional warfare and guerrilla tactics. The French forces thought they would be able to get air support, but even that failed. General Giap and his men specifically targeted their airstrips and transport planes. They were trapped. The French soldiers were dying, and they were unable to get supplies. As the casualties increased, French troops began to lose morale. However, despite their relentless attack, General Giap still had one final card up his sleeve. In May, he led the Viet Minh to launch a massive final attack on French positions in the valley. The French were overwhelmed and they gave up, with over 9,000 French soldiers surrendering to the Viet Minh. This victory sent shockwaves around the world. The Viet Minh had won, and Dien Bien Phu had fallen. It was the final blow for the French army. The war had become too costly to maintain, and they had no other choice but to leave Vietnam. It was their exit that led to the Geneva Conference of April 26, 1954. The aim of this conference was to deal with the issues from both the Korean War and the First Indochina War. There were multiple countries in attendance: France and Vietnam, who were represented by Ho Chí Minh and the Viet Minh, China, the United Kingdom, Laos, Cambodia, and even the United States and their arch-rival, the Soviet Union, were in attendance. The negotiations took place for over 70 days as they argued about the future of Vietnam. Finally, on July 21st, they were able to sign the Geneva Accords. Vietnam was free. It was agreed that no military personnel from foreign states should be allowed to enter Vietnam again unless requested by the local government. It was a huge victory for Ho Chí Minh and the Viet Minh, but their battle was far from over. It was only just beginning because, while Vietnam had been granted independence, some hidden seeds of discord were sown in Geneva. These seeds would only lead to a larger war that would never leave Vietnam the same. You see, even though the Geneva Accords granted Vietnam independence, they granted independence to a divided Vietnam. Initially, the Viet Minh was made up of all Vietnams, despite their beliefs. The only thing unifying them was a desire for independence. During the Geneva Conference, the thread holding this unity snapped, and Vietnam was divided into two zones in the 17th parallel. These two zones were North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam would be governed by the Viet Minh, who were staunch communists, while South Vietnam, which was more Western, would be governed under the former Emperor Bao Dai. Both sides were given 300 days to withdraw their troops and weapons, and go to their respective sides of the line. Vietnam was divided. However, Ho Chí Minh wasn't happy with this idea. His dream had been to see a united and independent Vietnam, and he and his supporters argued for this at the conference. Eventually, it was agreed that there would be nationwide elections in July 1956 to reunify Vietnam under one single government. It was a huge win for Ho Chí Minh because it meant that a democratic process would be used to determine Vietnam's future. However, this celebration had a sour side that only spelled doom from the very beginning. You see, many countries at the conference agreed to sign and uphold these agreements, including even China and France. However, the United States didn't. They insisted that they were not bound by these agreements, and their reasons were that they shared the sentiments of South Vietnamese leaders under Bao Dai. These South Vietnamese leaders didn't want to participate in elections that would bring in a communist government. The United States, as expected, was not pleased with the idea either. Nevertheless, the agreement had been signed and both groups returned to their sides of Vietnam. North Vietnam had major cities like Hanoi, while South Vietnam had cities like Saigon. In the north, Ho Chi Minh continued to declare himself as the leader of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He strongly believed in his dream of a united and independent Vietnam under communism. After what happened at Versailles, he was convinced that true freedom would never come to Vietnam from the West. He continued his land reforms, giving lands to poorer peasants and setting up a collective farming system. Using propaganda, he also pushed the people to believe in Marxist-Leninist thoughts. Ho Chi Minh's government spoke about itself as the true champion of Vietnamese independence. After all, they were the ones who had fought off the French colonial powers. Ho Chi Minh was convinced that there would need to be a battle to unite Vietnam, and because of this, he created an army. This army was known as the People's Army of Vietnam. It was a strong and disciplined force that was trained by both Chinese and Soviet advisors. Seeing that North Vietnam leaned into communist ideals, the Soviets had also begun to offer support to Ho Chi Minh. However, in South Vietnam, it was an entirely different story. Both sides were as different as black and white. In the South, Ngo Dinh Diem had been elected as prime minister, and he created the Republic of Vietnam. He leaned towards the West, and for this reason, he was staunchly against communist ideas. He also returned the Catholic Church in South Vietnam. With the Catholic Church restored, he tried to force everyone to accept Christianity and stamp out other religions, including Buddhism, which had been brought by the Chinese. As you can imagine, the Buddhists in South Vietnam didn't like him very much, nor did they support his leadership. But Ngo Dinh didn't care for that. He believed he had the support of the West, including the United States. He had a goal. His goal was to build a capitalist state in South Vietnam. This goal would never fully prosper. This was because he wasn't a popular leader, and political opponents protested against him. Diem suppressed these protests, and soon enough, his government was one of nepotism and corruption. The communists in South Vietnam protested his government, and he tried to squash them. Anyone who would even attempt to disagree with him was gotten rid of. Soon enough, the people of South Vietnam began to crumble. While Diem continued with his aggressive rule, the people mumbled about how he was just another colonial figure. What was the difference between a Vietnamese who didn't care about them and a French colonial ruler? Soon enough, they began to form groups that would oppose him. These groups were far from Diem and around the countryside. They were also mostly made up of Viet Minh fighters who had fought against the French. While Ngo Dinh Diem struggled to squash his opposition, another pressure was also brewing outside of South Vietnam. Unknown to him, South Vietnam was about to explode. While Ngo Dinh Diem struggled to squash his opposition, another pressure was also brewing outside of South Vietnam. Unknown to him, South Vietnam was about to explode. According to the Geneva Accords, both sides were to hold nationwide elections in 1956, so Vietnam would be unified under one government. Ho Chi Minh and his leaders in North Vietnam were assured that they were more popular and that they would win in a free and fair election. They had a reputation for being independence fighters. Also, they were a popular government in the North because of their land reforms and nationalism. Once they won, Ho Chi Minh believed that his dream would be achieved to see Vietnam united under a communist state. Ngo Dinh Diem, on the other hand, wasn't comfortable with the idea of an election. He suspected that Ho Chi Minh and his leaders would win, and then Vietnam would be taken over by communists. So, like he did whenever he feared opposition, he squashed the ideas. Diem had the support of the United States, and with their support, he stubbornly refused to hold the elections. He claimed that the North did not have any political freedom, and that any votes held in the North would be rigged because they were controlled by communism. All peaceful attempts made by Ho Chi Minh to reunify Vietnam were shut down by Diem. This was the beginning of an explosion that would burn across the entire state of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh and the rest of the North were pissed by Diem's refusal to hold the elections because it was part of their agreement at the Geneva Accords. Even worse, Ho Chi Minh saw Diem and his leaders as puppets of the West and the colonialists. He believed that Diem was being used to stop the true independence of the Vietnamese people, and he was determined to reunite Vietnam at all costs, even if it included another war. Remember that back in South Vietnam, some old fighters in the Viet Minh stayed behind in the countryside and had already begun to build resistance. Ho Chi Minh, aware of this group, gave the green light for them to begin to take up arms against the South. These old fighters were located in the rural areas where the people were feeling the pain inflicted by Diem's ruthless government. Most of these people also benefited from the reforms of Viet Minh during the First Indochina War and were tired of Diem's government. Soon enough, resistance was formed. In December 1960, a group known as the National Liberation Front, NLF, or the Viet Cong, was formed in Tay Ninh province. On the surface, it was simply a group of forces including former Viet Minh members, oppressed communists, angry locals, and anyone who simply wanted to get rid of Diem. However, beneath the surface, it was a group heavily sponsored by Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam, and they had one goal: overthrowing the government of South Vietnam. You see, Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap were at work again. This time, they wanted to unite Vietnam by all means. Ho Chi Minh knew that they couldn't come out openly to fight against Diem's government. If they even dared to invade the South, it would trigger the United States to intervene immediately. The only way to topple Diem was by using internal means. It had to look like the people of South Vietnam were against the government, even though it would all be directed from Hanoi. General Giap once again had to rely on the tactics that had helped them defeat the French: guerrilla warfare. From North Vietnam, he would control and direct these tactics to the NLF or Viet Cong in the rural side of South Vietnam. The group was divided into two parts. The NLF was the political arm of the group, and the Viet Cong was the military arm of the group. While it looked like the group was simply showing the will of the southern people, Ho Chi Minh and General Giap would be moving the threads from behind to destabilize Diem. The Viet Cong was created quietly in the shadows of the rural South. The war veterans who had stayed behind after the Geneva Accords led the attacks. They were experienced in guerrilla warfare and knew the terrain. The best part was that Diem wasn't very popular among the people, so the Viet Cong also had the support of the people in the countryside. They set up their camps in these rural areas, mostly deep in the jungles, where they were sure Diem's army would never reach. However, to fully be able to make an impact, they needed weapons, supplies, and training for those who were not war veterans but wanted to join the cause. This help would have to come from North Vietnam, but there was a problem. North Vietnam couldn't help openly. They had to help secretly in a way that would not alert Diem and his forces or trigger the United States. They had to make sure it all looked like the revolution was internal. So, Ho Chi Minh had to come up with a plan. This plan was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail was a network of roads that linked from North Vietnam into Laos and Cambodia before finding its way into the jungles in South Vietnam. The trail was genius. North Vietnamese workers and their soldiers spent years constructing the trail in secret, and when it was ready, it was used to supply arms to the Viet Cong, so they could be strong enough for the revolution. Fully armed, the Viet Cong strategy was the same old strategy that had helped them win the First Indochina War. They would not attack Diem's army head-on. Instead, they would launch ambushes on the military and destroy infrastructure, including buildings, trains, railways, and bridges. They also found ways to assassinate leaders and officials who supported President Diem and were loyal to him. They created utter chaos in hopes of making the Vietnamese government look weak and as though it couldn't maintain peace. Their tactics were very devastating. Even though Diem's forces had better weapons, they were mostly trained for conventional warfare. They didn't fully understand the Viet Minh's strategies and didn't know how to fight an enemy that would simply disappear after an attack. To make it worse, when they tried to follow the Viet Cong into the jungle or wherever they were hiding, they would be ambushed, hurt by painful booby traps, or killed by enemies who knew the terrain far better than they did. By the early 1960s, the Viet Cong was no longer a small insurgent group. They were a full guerrilla army and launched bolder and more coordinated attacks that put President Diem under intense pressure. But if you think Diem was sitting down the entire time watching them overthrow him, then you couldn't be more wrong. Ngo Dinh Diem, upon hearing about the insurgents in the countryside, instantly knew they were communists trying to topple his regime. In his typical style, his government imprisoned and killed anyone who was a suspected communist and conducted crackdowns in the countryside. His soldiers would raid villages where they thought communists were hiding, destroy houses, and kill suspects. Yet, instead of suppressing his opposition, his drastic crackdowns only swelled the flames. If you're wondering why, it was because Diem and his forces didn't know that aside from their military training, the Viet Cong also had another secret. This secret was also a major strength for them and worked to further ruin Diem's reputation and make it difficult for him. You see, the Viet Cong knew how to blend with the local population and mix with the villagers. They had stayed in the south, so they knew most of the villages. To make matters worse, Diem and his government were seen as corrupt, harsh, and oppressive. The Viet Cong would promise these villagers that, should they win the fight, they would conduct land reforms similar to what was happening in the north, and would fight those wealthy elites controlling the south. For this reason, it was easy for them to get support from villagers. These villagers would shelter the Viet Cong fighters and hide their weapons. They would also inform the fighters about the movements and plans of the South Vietnamese army. This support made it hard for Diem to root out the insurgents. They had to work based on suspicions since they couldn't tell who was a civilian from who was a Viet Cong fighter. They would sometimes act drastically in paranoia, burning villages, imprisoning, killing, and punishing innocents as well. This only further made Diem seem oppressive. But this war wasn't simply about who controlled Vietnam. Outside of Vietnam, the world was deep in the middle of the Cold War, and Vietnam was a key battleground because of how torn it was. Ho Chí Minh and his leaders up north saw communism as his way of fighting against Western imperialism. He believed that if Vietnam was united under a communist government, it would encourage other states fighting for their independence and tell the West that their years of imperialism were over. But forces outside Vietnam had a different idea. One of those forces was the United States. For the United States, the stakes were much more than the local politics of the Vietnamese people. The stakes were about democracy in Southeast Asia. You see, after World War II, the Soviet Union had grown in power, and the spread of communism was growing. In 1949, mainland China had fallen to communism, and as if that wasn't enough, the United States had also received a recent blow at the time. In July 1953, the bloody Korean War had ended in a stalemate with no winner, and the border revision remained the same. If that was allowed to happen in Vietnam, what would happen to the whole of Southeast Asia? One man in the United States was seriously thinking about this question. That man's name was President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Long before the rise of the Viet Cong, President Eisenhower had been worried about what was happening in Vietnam. It was his worry that gave birth to the domino theory. He spoke about the domino theory for the first time in 1954, after the First Indochina War was ending. President Eisenhower warned the world that if one country in Southeast Asia became a communist state, others would also follow, like a row of dominoes collapsing one by one. He claimed that should Vietnam fall to communism, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and eventually Indonesia and India would also fall to communism.
If we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go.
President Eisenhower wasn't going to sit back and watch on with folded arms. He and the United States government wanted to contain the spread of communism globally. To stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, he had to make sure Vietnam didn't become a red state. To do that, Vietnam became the front line of America's Cold War strategy. However, President Eisenhower knew this would not be an easy battle. He had seen Dien Bien Phu fall and France defeated. If the French, with all of their military might, couldn't stop the Viet Minh and China, how could the government of South Vietnam stop them? Even worse, the government was already crumbling under pressure from the Viet Cong. But that wasn't the only battle. The United States had recently left the Korean War. It was a costly and brutal war that didn't change much. So he was very cautious about getting into another war so soon. He decided to come up with a plan. He planned that instead of sending foot soldiers to the South Vietnamese government, he would instead support them with financial and military aid. Luckily, President Ngo Dinh Diem was very anti-communist. He was perfect to help hold the forte. Not only did he offer aid, but like Russia and China, he also sent military advisors to South Vietnam to train the troops. Eisenhower spent millions of dollars trying to strengthen South Vietnam's military. However, the more he and the American government tried, the more they realized that there was an even bigger problem they had missed. This problem would ruin all their efforts. The problem was none other than their frontline man, President Ngo Dinh Diem himself. Back in South Vietnam, Diem wasn't a very popular figure. He lacked support from the rural villages, and he was harsh. Even the elites were slowly starting to turn against him. President Eisenhower was starting to doubt if President Diem could even unite the country. He wasn't even popular in the South. How on earth was he going to win the North over? Eisenhower needed a strong South Vietnamese leadership if he was going to resist the influence of Ho Chí Minh and the Viet Cong. But Diem's government alienated more than half of the population, and this only allowed the Viet Cong to grow stronger and more popular. By the late 1950s, President Eisenhower and his government grew restless. His term was nearing its end, and the Viet Cong grew only stronger. What would he do? Did he continue only to support South Vietnam and hope it didn't collapse? Or did he and the United States have to take matters into their own hands to stop Vietnam from falling like the first domino? Well, interestingly, Eisenhower never got to make that decision until he left office in 1961. He was replaced by President John F. Kennedy. When President Kennedy got into power, he had some problems already awaiting him. One of these issues was the crisis in Vietnam, and it wasn't going down anytime soon. Sticking to his predecessor's initial plan, Kennedy increased support for Diem and the South Vietnamese government. He sent fighter jets and other armories and also increased the number of American military advisors in South Vietnam from a little above 600 to almost 18,000. Like Eisenhower, he also wanted to strengthen Diem's regime and boost their economic support as well. But like a house on a shaky foundation, their efforts failed to yield results because of Diem himself and his lack of popular support. President Kennedy and President Ngo Diem had to come up with a new plan to help achieve their goal. This plan was known as the Strategic Hamlets Program. The goal of the program was to secure the rural areas and win the hearts of the villagers. They would build fortified villages to house the locals and lock out the Viet Cong fighters so they could not mix with the villagers. President Kennedy liked the idea and supported it, but you guessed it, the plan also failed and its progress was very slow. They weren't able to win the popular support of the people. You already know why. By the end of 1962, John Kennedy was already beginning to doubt whether or not the U.S. should intervene in the issues brewing in South Vietnam. It was obvious that Diem's government was harsh and authoritarian and not loved by the people. By 1963, Diem persecuted some more Buddhists and people he suspected of supporting the Viet Cong. This action led to widespread protests against Diem. Soon enough, there were plans to overthrow President Ngo Dinh Diem and stage a coup. John F. Kennedy had intelligence about this coup sometime in August, long before it happened. He spoke to his advisors, and they were torn on the issue. Some of them believed that President Diem was the best option for fighting communism, while others thought that he was being authoritarian and it was undermining all their efforts. John F. Kennedy found himself leaning toward the guys who thought Diem was wasting their efforts with his style of government. Things were about to get very interesting and heated. Now, it may interest you to know that the coup in South Vietnam wasn't staged by the Viet Cong, but by Diem's own military officers who were tired of Diem's government. They were still anti-communist, but they didn't like his style of leadership. These officers were men like General Duong Van Minh, who was the leader of the coup, and General Tran Van Don, who was the then army chief. When Kennedy learned of this, he decided that they had nothing to lose. If they could get rid of Diem and still have anti-communist leadership, it would be a win-win. He called for Diem and asked him to sign a document agreeing to resign as president of South Vietnam. If he resigned, then they would offer him American protection. Well, Diem had done everything to keep himself in power. He wasn't about to hand it over so easily now, so he refused. Kennedy, using the help of the CIA, then offered tacit support to the coup plotters. However, things went out of hand. On November 1st, 1963, General Duong Van Minh led a group of officers and staged a coup. They captured Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu. By the next day, they were executed.
Within 18 hours, the revolt was over, and a military junta under General Duong Van Minh had taken over. They named Diem's vice president as premier of a caretaker regime which has been recognized by the United States.
President Kennedy felt terrible.
In my judgment, that Hawaii was badly drafted. Comrades should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views.
He hadn't imagined that Diem would be assassinated. However, it didn't matter much. Barely 20 days thereafter, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy would unfortunately be faced with the same fate. After President Kennedy's assassination, a new man came into office who took on the responsibility of the United States' interest in the situation in Vietnam once again. This man was President Lyndon B. Johnson. Unlike President Kennedy, President Johnson didn't think about his strategy. He believed fully in the domino effect and wanted to secure South Vietnam at all costs. He believed that the United States should not sit on the sidelines and watch Vietnam fall. So he became deeply involved in the conflict. He hadn't sent troops yet, but things were heating up and everything was soon about to change. On August 2, 1964, U.S. Navy ships, including the USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy, were conducting surveillance missions in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. The only issue with this was that the Gulf of Turkic was located in the northeastern part of North Vietnam. It bordered major North Vietnam provinces such as Haiphong, Tay Binh, and Quang Ninh. Secondly, these missions carried out by the United States Navy ships were to secretly attack North Vietnamese installations and radar stations. Ho Chi Minh and other North Vietnamese leaders saw this as an attack and decided to confront the ships. On August 2nd, they attacked the USS Maddox. Both sides ended up exchanging fire. Somehow, the Maddox escaped mostly without damage, but the thread of peace had already been broken. 2 days later, there were reports that another U.S. vessel had been attacked. Later on, people would argue whether this second attack happened. In fact, in 2002, much later, it would be revealed by intelligence reports that the attack never even happened. However, at the time, it was more than enough for a very eager President Lyndon Johnson to jump into action. In a matter of days, he spoke to the nation and announced that U.S. forces had been directly attacked by North Vietnam in international waters.
It is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin.
He claimed that the attack was unprovoked, despite their initial reasons for being there in the first place. He also said that this attack was a direct threat to the United States and their interests in Vietnam. He called for the support of the public to engage fully in the war. This was an easy request. Most Americans at the time were already worried about the spread of communism and easily rallied behind their president. With this approval, President Johnson was emboldened and he moved fast. He took the matter to the American Congress, and by August 7th, the Congress gave him what he wanted. They resolved that President Lyndon Johnson had the authority to take all necessary measures to stop any armed attack against U.S. forces and any aggression that was to come. This agreement was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. To put it in simple terms, it was basically a blank check that would allow Johnson to fully get involved in the war. President Johnson had always been eager to squash communist movements in Vietnam, and now that he had the go-ahead, he wasted no time. He marched troops and arms into South Vietnam to help defend the government. However, the Viet Cong were not afraid. They attacked several U.S. military installations in South Vietnam. On the 7th of February 1965, they attacked U.S. troops in Pleiku and ended up killing 8 Americans. Several were wounded. For President Johnson and his advisors, enough was enough. This was the final straw. By March, the United States started an operation that would set North Vietnam on fire and change the history of the war forever. Furious, President Johnson took drastic measures to deal with the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. He came up with a massive campaign that he believed would solve the issue once and for all. This campaign was called Operation Rolling Thunder. It was a massive bombing campaign that would last for over 3 years. From March 1965 until November 1968, Johnson and the U.S. forces consistently bombed North Vietnam. On the surface, Johnson's goal was simple. It was to cut off the support the Viet Cong got from North Vietnam. They would do this by destroying supply routes, infrastructure, and military bases. However, beneath the surface, there was another reason for such consistent bombing. It was also a psychological war. You see, President Johnson and the U.S. forces hoped that such an amount of consistent and devastating destruction would force Ho Chí Minh and the leaders of North Vietnam to surrender and agree to negotiations. He hoped that the Vietnamese people would see the amount of destruction and break, turning to their government to take the logical option of the negotiation table. It was no ordinary bombing. Every day bombers flew from military bases in South Vietnam and neighboring countries like Thailand. They dropped tons of bombs in North Vietnam. In the first few months, they bombed depots, bridges, military bases, and supply lines in North Vietnam. Later on, they also began bombing transportation networks. One of these networks was the Ho Chí Minh Trail, which had been used to supply support and weapons to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. However, President Johnson and the U.S. forces were in for a serious surprise. You see, Ho Chí Minh and the leaders of North Vietnam were not fazed by the bombings. Ho Chí Minh soon realized what was happening and decided he would not just sit back and let the U.S. destroy North Vietnam. Once again, he went to his allies, China and the Soviet Union. With their help, they prepared for the bombings. They were able to gather radar systems, surface-to-air missiles, and anti-aircraft guns to build an air defense network. With this network, they were able to resist the United States air bombing strikes. They shot down several air vessels and captured several pilots. Strangely, the bombing had only strengthened their resolve in a free and united Vietnam. under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, the people rebuilt the destroyed bridges and roads. They worked both day and night to also repair the supply lines. Despite the consistent bombing, they worked to restore the Ho Chi Minh Trail and continued to send support to the Viet Cong in the south. It was almost as though the destruction did not affect their activities. The truth was that Ho Chi Minh and his generals soon realized that the American forces weren't going to stop their bombing anytime soon. To deal with this, they began building underground tunnels and started to move more and more of their operations underground. Operation Rolling Thunder was soon becoming a rolling disaster. President Johnson had hoped that it would be fast and quick, but he was appalled to see it dragging on. Soon enough, the American people started to see pictures of bombed cities and villages in North Vietnam. The operation had also killed over 100,000 Vietnamese, including soldiers and civilians. The U.S. Army had also lost over 1,000 lives, and over 500 of their aircraft had been shot down and destroyed beyond repair. The American people were becoming less and less pleased by this war. Soon enough, they took to the streets of America in protests. Left with no choice, President Johnson had to put an end to the relentless bombing in November 1968. However, if you're thinking this meant he was going to give up, then you're in for a surprise. For President Johnson, this wasn't the end. It only meant that he needed to rethink his strategy. He would not be able to defeat Vietnam from the skies. He had to go on the ground to fight them in the cities, in their bases, and in the jungles.
And who trusted us to the terror and repression and murder that would follow.
President Johnson then announced that he was sending more foot soldiers to Vietnam and increasing the U.S. presence in Vietnam to almost 500,000 soldiers. His plan was to directly fight the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army in South Vietnam. They hoped that they could save South Vietnam from falling to communism. The ground forces would be sent to areas such as the Mekong Delta, Saigon, the Central Highlands, and the border South Vietnam, shared with the North. This operation would be led by a man who had stayed in South Vietnam for a while and had an understanding of the war. His name was General William Westmoreland. General Westmoreland was the commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam. He had stayed in Vietnam for a while and had a plan of how to defeat their enemies. His plan was for the U.S. Army to conduct large-scale search and destroy missions alongside air support. So, the first thing he did was to set up military bases in places like Cam Ranh Bay, Khe Sanh, and Da Nang. It was from these bases that they launched operations into enemy territory. On the surface, the plan was simple. The search and destroy missions involved helicopters dropping soldiers into jungles that were suspected of hiding Viet Cong fighters. The plan was to simply fight the enemy, destroy their bases, and then quickly withdraw. However, it was harder than it seemed. The terrain was difficult. There were jungles and mountains. To make it worse, there were also rice paddies. These were filled with water and made walking difficult. They were sometimes infested with leeches, and when they weren't, they had booby traps placed by the Viet Cong. This made it almost impossible to find the Viet Cong fighters. The bitter truth was that General Westmoreland had greatly undermined the Viet Cong and their preparations. He didn't know as much as he thought he did. You see, thanks to all the bombings, the North's strategy shifted drastically. The guerrilla fighters moved not just deeper into the jungle, but also moved underground. Beneath the ground, they had an extensive network of tunnels that would stretch for miles. You never knew where one started and where it ended, or where it was leading. These tunnels had rooms that served as living quarters, supplies, weapons, and even hospitals. With the help of these tunnels, they were able to stay elusive. The guerrilla fighters would come out and ambush the U.S. Army and then vanish. Those who were not ambushed or sabotaged struggled to deal with the heat, disease, and traps left for them in the jungle. the Viet Cong soldiers also had a way of blending in with the villagers and then disappearing into the jungle after a brutal attack. If the US Army managed to clear a village by day, the Viet Cong would return by night. No matter the victories they had, the Viet Cong had a way of erasing them. The United States had sent troops, but there was no conventional war. At some point, it started to seem like they were fighting smoke. They were left with only one option if they wanted to get to the Viet Cong: to go into the tunnels. To fight this underground war, the US could not use a typical soldier. They needed special kinds of soldiers. These soldiers were small but courageous men who would go into the ground and crawl through these claustrophobic tunnels. They could not carry loads of weapons except a flashlight and a pistol. Sometimes carrying a flashlight gave their position away, so they had to go in the dark. These soldiers were known as tunnel rats. Being a tunnel rat was one of the most dangerous jobs in the Vietnam War. Several of them went into the tunnels and never came out alive. This was because the tunnels were often filled with booby traps. These traps included spikes, explosives, and poisonous creatures like snakes and scorpions. A rat could bump into the top of the tunnel and unleash a swarm of scorpions on himself. A tunnel rat had to be on high alert at all times because every corner could bring an ambush and he would die. It was a terrifying task. While the soldiers of the United States Army were risking their lives in tunnels, you might be wondering what the South Vietnamese Army was doing at this time. Well, not very much. You see, the South Vietnamese Army, also known as the ARVN, was undertrained and was often not well led. Plus, even the new government was corrupt at its core. So, while the United States Army was busy fighting major operations, the South Vietnamese Army had one job: to maintain control in the rural villages and countryside. This was because these areas were some of the first to support the Viet Cong and needed to be under control. However, the ARVN was failing at this job. They were ineffective, and the US Army had to do most of the work to keep the Viet Cong from winning, as it was clear that South Vietnam could not win this war on their own. Interestingly, General Giap and North Vietnam weren't even trying to win the war. On the contrary, they saw it as a war of attrition. It was the same way they had seen the battle with France. All they had to do was draw the war for as long as possible until the United States grew tired and began to feel the war was too costly to carry on fighting. Even though President Lyndon B. Johnson had Americanized the war, he quickly learned that defeating North Vietnam wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. They had bombed from the air and failed. They had sent ground troops and were still struggling. What were they to do next? While President Johnson asked himself this question, something was about to happen that would shake the US military and South Vietnam at their core. It was on the 31st of January 1968. This was the date for the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, and everyone in Vietnam was busy celebrating TET. During this time, a ceasefire was agreed to, for both sides to enjoy peace while the celebrations went on. However, the TET of 1968 was not going to be like the other ones. Something happened that would change the history of the Vietnam War. While it looked like Ho Chí Minh and General Giap were pulling through, they also knew they needed a way to destabilize the South Vietnamese government and the United States. General Vo Nguyen Giap then birthed a brilliant idea. This idea was what would become the TET Offensive. You see, General Giap knew that they could not defeat the US military in direct combat. However, they had won against the French in Dien Bien Phu by a large-scale offensive. His idea was that doing the same to the United States would also break their will and let them see how costly the war was. Aside from that, a large-scale offensive would destroy the South Vietnamese government. He planned to host a massive coordinated surprise attack on over 100 cities in South Vietnam, including United States military bases. It was one of the most daring military attacks of the 20th century. However, since the attack was to come as a surprise, they had to take advantage when the U.S. Army was least expecting it, and what better time than during the peace period given to celebrate TET. For the last quarter of 1967, North Vietnam and the Viet Cong began preparing for the attack. They secretly moved weapons and ammunition into cities like Saigon, Da Nang, and Hue. They would hide these weapons in their underground tunnels and bunkers away from the eyes of the U.S. and South Vietnamese armies. Over 85,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops moved into these cities and took their positions waiting for the TET celebrations. Then on the night of January 30th, 1968, they struck. The attacks were coordinated and took place across South Vietnam all at once. In Saigon, the Viet Cong attacked the American embassy. They broke through the outer walls and got into the compound, with several other fighters out on the streets of Saigon, engaging the U.S. Army. While it might look like the attack in Saigon was the most intense, thanks to the attack on the U.S. Embassy, it wasn't. The most intense battles took place in Hue, with Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces taking control of the city. They attacked over 100 cities, taking control of most of these cities. The U.S. and South Vietnamese armies had been caught off guard. It was jarring to see such a large-scale offensive when they should have been celebrating a quiet holiday. Nonetheless, the United States Army responded as fast as they could. Most of the U.S. soldiers were stationed far away from the attacked cities, and it was difficult to bring them down at once. Despite the chaos, the U.S. military fought in Saigon to defend the embassy and protect their key government buildings. The war was so intense that the U.S. Marines had to be sent to Hue for one of the most intense combats of the offensive. Using the Marines, they tried to take control of the city and went from house to house fighting the guerrilla fighters. By the end of that month, Hue was destroyed. Several civilians had been killed, with several others rendered homeless as their houses were reduced to rubble in the middle of the war. The war was brutal, and the guerrilla fighters were once again using their signature tactics. U.S. forces would see them destroy buildings and then vanish back into the jungle or mix with the people. They didn't know who was a guerrilla fighter or which building they were resident in. They had to recapture the city block by block, as every building could be a trap or a potential ambush site. General Giap, on the other hand, being an incredibly wise military leader, knew that even though they might not win the military war, they would win the psychological war. He believed that if he could hit so many targets at once, it would send ripples across the world. It would show outsiders and even the American people back home that the U.S. military wasn't winning the war. The attack would be a surprise, and they'd have gained some ground before even the U.S. military would be able to think of a counterattack, further increasing the cost of the war. They would also prove to the South Vietnamese people that their government was a failure because nowhere in South Vietnam was safe, not even in Saigon, where the U.S. Embassy was domiciled. However, by the end of the attack, the TET offensive was a military failure. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese suffered huge casualties and lost over 45,000 fighters. To worsen things, the South Vietnamese government didn't collapse. Surprisingly, they, alongside the United States forces, were able to regain most of the territory that the Viet Cong had attacked. Nevertheless, General Giap had been correct. They won the psychological war. Due to the large-scale nature of the TET offensive, it rippled across the globe and even throughout the United States. Despite what was happening, the people back in America were made to believe that the U.S. was winning the war and that all their efforts were paying off. However, when news carried that Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces had not only attacked cities across South Vietnam, but even managed to attack Saigon, it was clear that it was all a lie. The fighters hadn't only attacked Saigon, they'd also managed to get into the United States Embassy. Hearing this, the American public began to doubt everything they had been told about the war, mostly because it suddenly became clear that they were not winning. In the past, the media had relied on military briefings to report the war. However, with these attacks and with calls from the populace, the media began to look at Vietnam closely, and when they did, they had pictures of horror. Pictures that showed destroyed cities, body bags, and wounded soldiers. The Tet Offensive had become a turning point for the people of America. One journalist was able to further shake their opinions even more, who was none other than the famous Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was a U.S. journalist who had supported the war in the past. He believed in the domino theory and believed that the United States was winning the war. He was trusted by the people, and sometimes some even called him the most trusted man in America. However, after hearing of the Tet Offensive and the attack on the embassy, Cronkite wanted to see for himself. He traveled to Vietnam to witness what was going on. He realized that the war was more bloody than reported and that the U.S. might not win.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
In a broadcast made on February 22, 1968, Walter Cronkite told Americans that the war would end in a stalemate. His broadcast changed everything. If Cronkite, a man who had been so certain, was now doubtful about the war, then all hope was lost. He wasn't the only one. Other news stations like CBS, ABC, and NBC also started to show the bloody realities of the war.
Other small bands still roam the city. The Viet Cong are reported to be in complete control of a militant Buddhist headquarters less than a mile from the center of town.
They showed U.S. soldiers fighting in the streets, trying to win a guerrilla war. They showed several of those soldiers murdered and several others injured, with the injured ones taken away by helicopters. They showed several civilians homeless and attacked. They also destroyed the villages. For the first time, the American people were seeing true images of the war, and they were horrified. They took to the streets and began to protest against this war they considered pointless. Those who had been in support now felt the war wasn't worth all the lives and resources that were being lost. There were protests in major cities, streets, and college campuses against the war, with several attacking President Johnson for keeping the war ongoing for this long. Remember that President B. Johnson had come in with guns blazing, certain that the best thing to do was to continue fighting Vietnam. However, even upon seeing the Tet Offensive, they knew that they were very far away from winning the war. His problems were compounding, as U.S. citizens were now on the streets, declaring that they had lost faith both in President Johnson and the war itself. With each passing day, the pressure grew worse. The protests on the streets swelled, the media reported negatively against him, and soon enough, members of his party also joined in. They asked Johnson if he really had a firm handle on things, and if the war was winnable. As the presidential elections drew nearer, President Johnson's popularity dropped. By March 1968, barely 2 months after the Tet Offensive, his approval ratings hit rock bottom. He was pressured to leave Vietnam, both by U.S. citizens and by the members of his party, the Democratic Party. By March 31st, President Lyndon B. Johnson cocked his guns and addressed the nation. This address was a huge shock because he said that he would not be seeking re-election in the forthcoming U.S. elections.
Accordingly, I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Even more, he showed that the Vietnam War had cost him both U.S. finances and his shot at re-election. Despite this announcement, protests intensified. In spite of losing the military war, General Giap and Ho Chi Minh had taken the victory of the psychological war. The Tet Offensive had broken the will of the American public to fight. President Johnson had also stepped down. But even with this great victory, they still couldn't celebrate. There were still several questions that needed to be answered. What would happen now? Would the United States forces remain in Vietnam? The Tet Offensive had sparked chaos in the United States. There was an explosion of anger and multiple calls for a change. Like North and South Vietnam, the United States was now divided over the war in Vietnam. Were they to remain or to pull out? By the latter months of 1968, more people had moved towards the choice of pulling out. Cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco had millions of Americans, including war veterans, holding placards demanding an end to the war.
Lieutenant Pomerol died, so I got a medal. Sergeant John died, so I got a medal.
These protests spilt outside of the United States and onto the international stage. As the protests continued, its purpose improved. It wasn't simply about the war anymore. There was more beneath the surface. To keep this very demanding war going, the United States had to draft more young men to join the army. Initially, people had joined voluntarily, united by a cause, but now that there was more media coverage of the war, it was obvious that they were losing. The question arose of whether America was even right to be there in the first place. With morale lost, people were tired of watching their loved ones being taken to war on another continent. Mostly because they no longer believed in the cause of the war, and while the government promised them progress, it sure did not seem like that was happening or going to happen. Yet, the US government was still drafting young men, some of whom had barely left high school, to join the army and fight this war. Even worse, the Selective Service had an eligible pool of 27 million men, and they had drafted over 2 million men. However, those drafted were mostly working class and minority individuals who didn't get deferment through education or connections. When the populace observed this trend, they saw the injustice that these young men, who had little to no choice, were being forced to fight a war whose cause they didn't support. This realization led to a movement known as the draft resistance. On college campuses, students came out to protest the drafts. Several students in universities like the University of California, Kent State, Columbia University, and Berkeley came out to speak against the draft. In San Francisco and New York, citizens burned the draft cards and declared that they would not serve to show that they were not in support. But it wasn't just students protesting. Influential figures were also starting to protest. One of these figures was Martin Luther King Jr. In April 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech at Riverside Church in New York City. In that speech, he denounced the war and asked the U.S. to stop fighting in Vietnam and instead focus on issues affecting Americans back at home. Issues such as poverty and racism. He accused the American government of being the cause of violence in the world.
Perhaps the more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home.
Luther's speech was received as very controversial, and it made waves across the country. But he wasn't the only one. One of the greatest fighters of all time, Muhammad Ali, also spoke on the war. Muhammad Ali had kept silent until he was drafted to serve in the U.S. military. Initially, Ali had scored poorly in the qualifying test, but the American military, needing more soldiers urgently, had lowered the standards for entry. Therefore, with this adjustment, Ali was deemed eligible. However, Muhammad Ali refused to be drafted into the military. He claimed that he was a Muslim and war was against the teachings of the Quran. He also said he never had any quarrels with the Viet Cong, and they had never used a racial slur on him before.
My conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some poor hungry people in the mud for big powerful America and shoot them for what? They never called me nigger.
This statement added to the cries of those who thought this war was unjust. However, the United States government disagreed. Not only was he stripped of his heavyweight belts and boxing license in every state in the United States, Muhammad Ali was stripped off his passport. But it didn't stop there. The undisputed champion was arrested and convicted for draft evasion and sentenced to prison for his refusal to serve. Even though his conviction was later overturned in 1971 as a technical error from the Justice Department, his stance had given support to anti-war sentiments. In 1968, the Democratic Party was having their national convention in Chicago. However, thousands of left-wing, counterculture, and anti-Vietnam groups, including people who felt that President Johnson wasn't listening, stood outside Grant Park and Michigan Avenue, demanding an end to the war. This peaceful demonstration eventually led to a clash with the police. The media carried videos of clubs, injured and bleeding protesters, and tear gas being used. These images sent shock to families watching at home, and even more people moved to call for the end of the war. These sentiments spilled out of the United States and across Europe, Asia, and Australia. In the United Kingdom, people protested along the streets, calling for an end to the war. Students of Oxford University came out holding placards and calling for an end to the offensive in Vietnam. In France, the same thing was happening. People came out to protest the war, and these protests eventually led to airstrikes in May of 1968 that brought the country to a standstill. In Japan, protesters stood outside U.S. military bases and official buildings demanding the end to the war in Vietnam. With all the protests happening, President Lyndon Johnson was under a lot of pressure. No one wanted the war, and they had accrued losses thanks to the TET offensive. He struggled to justify the U.S. being in Vietnam. Even worse, his party members were starting to abandon him, leaving him alone to justify the war. However, this would not be his problem forever. By 1969, President B. Johnson left office and left the pressures of the war to a new president, President Richard Nixon.
Please repeat after me. I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear. I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear.
When President Richard Nixon assumed power, the pressure to end the war only intensified. During his campaigns, he promised the American people peace with honor. But now the American people didn't even care about honor. They simply wanted the war to end and for the United States to withdraw. President Nixon entered into office with 1 million questions to solve. How would he deal with these ticking bombs? Richard Nixon was a man with a huge problem. Here he was as the 37th President of the United States, fighting a war that had consumed the U.S. for close to a decade. To worsen it, no one wanted it anymore, but he alone was the one tasked with ending it. Richard Nixon had campaigned on peace with honor, and he desperately wanted that honor. The United States couldn't just run away from Vietnam with its tail between its legs as though it had been defeated. It had to leave honorably. And that's when Nixon came up with a plan. This plan was known as Vietnamization. You see, while Johnson had Americanized the war, Nixon hoped to pull back American forces and Vietnamize it. His plan was exactly that, to transfer the war from American shoulders to the shoulders of the South Vietnamese. They would train and equip the South Vietnamese Army, or the ARVN, so that they could defend the South against Ho Chí Minh and North Vietnam. This way, the U.S. military could slowly withdraw without admitting defeat. So, in November 1969, Nixon addressed the U.S. citizens. He pleaded with those who were not on the streets protesting, but still believed in the war effort, but were now tired of seeing U.S. soldiers die. He called them the silent majority.
The great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support.
In that speech, he said that this strategy would be the way of bringing them peace with honor. They would slowly bring the U.S. forces home and still support the South Vietnamese government. This was the beginning of the withdrawal of American soldiers. By June 1969, he had pulled out over 25,000 troops, and in 2 years, he pulled over 350,000 troops from Vietnam, and the goal was to fully withdraw by 1973. However, there was a huge problem. As the United States left, the South Vietnamese Army was left to fight North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. And, as you've probably guessed, seeing the American presence reduced was only fuel to the fire burning in General Giap and Ho Chí Minh. They doubled down on their attacks and continued attacking cities and villages in South Vietnam using their signature tactics. They would hit and run, ambush the soldiers, and use their tunnels. While Nixon's plan looked great, it wasn't. Mostly because the ARVN, despite all the training and equipment gotten from the US, were still not ready for the war. The Viet Cong had increased their attacks and the South Vietnamese soldiers were doing badly. They didn't have the numbers, and even worse with the United States leaving them, they felt deserted and had low morale. They also didn't have firepower or solid coordination. When you add the obvious corruption in the military, it was obvious they were seriously struggling. But Nixon had promised the American society, so he continued pulling out the troops anyway. But despite this, people continued protesting. While some were happy and relieved that the troops were finally coming home, others felt he was to take the troops all at once and he was only dragging out the inevitable. So several of them kept protesting against the slow withdrawals, holding placards that said, "Bring them all home now." While Nixon dealt with this pressure, he also dealt with South Vietnamese pressure. President Nguyen Van Thieu, the South Vietnamese president, wasn't pleased with the U.S. withdrawal. He said that his army was still ill-prepared, and that without American support, the scales would be tipped in favor of the North, and they would be vulnerable. Despite the protests and his pleading, President Nixon kept to his Vietnamization strategy. He pulled back the forces in batches and promised President Thieu that the United States would support them with both military and financial help. But that wasn't enough. The South Vietnamese army was left fighting dangerous battles that they seemed to lose. One of those was the Viet Cong attacks on the Mekong Delta. President Nixon, however, continued to support South Vietnam in hopes of keeping them afloat. He sent planes, artillery, military supplies, and tanks, but it never looked like it would be enough. President Nixon, on the other hand, told the populace that his strategy was a success. In a public address, he said that South Vietnam was getting more capable by the day and that their army had been strengthened, but in reality, everything was falling apart. Nevertheless, there were still some American soldiers left in South Vietnam, and before leaving, they had to solve the elephant in the room. the Viet Cong continued attacking South Vietnam, which they were majorly able to do because of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While North Vietnam didn't officially attack South Vietnam, they had been using this trail since the beginning to send supplies to the Viet Cong. By 1969, it was a little too obvious that to effectively reduce the power of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, they had to close down that trail. Once President Nixon saw this, he decided that they had to strike, and in March 1968, they launched Operation Menu. The goal of the operation was to bomb places where they suspected Ho Chi Minh was and cut off Viet Cong supply lines. However, this time, they wouldn't just be bombing North Vietnam. They would bomb the parts of the trail that went through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia. Laos and Cambodia had been very neutral during the war, but there were several Viet Cong hiding places in Cambodia. To do this meant that President Nixon and the United States forces were taking the war outside Vietnam, and that was the catch. They couldn't let this be known by the American public or by Congress. President Nixon had been selling that they were moving out of Vietnam. If the people knew, he feared it would bring huge backlash, mostly because Cambodia and Laos had been neutral since the beginning. He also argued that it was the only way to stop Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam from getting the upper hand. In his opinion, this was necessary if they would ever win the war. They began bombing, a large-scale bombing operation. It was staggering. They dropped over 400,000 tons of bombs in Laos and over 2 million tons in Cambodia. This bombing destroyed several villages. Thousands of civilians in these locations were killed, and some were rendered homeless. To worsen things, the trail continued to function, with the Viet Cong fixing it as soon as it was destroyed. But that wasn't the worst part. Back in America, the news of the bombings leaked and sparked outrage among the people. Everyone was furious. From students to activities and even members of Congress, they felt betrayed. Nixon's biggest nightmare had come true. Feeling betrayed, the crowds returned to the streets in protest. Universities that had been on the front lines of the protests saw the crowds once again. One of those universities where the crowds were beginning to gather was Kent State University in the state of Ohio. Students in the university started a peaceful protest against President Nixon's betrayal on the 1st of May. They were frustrated and angry, and the protests grew constantly in intensity. By the 3rd of May, the governor of Ohio, Governor Rhodes, spoke against the protests, and Kent Mayor Leroy Satcham declared a state of emergency. He also called the National Guard to come out and maintain order, but this wouldn't stop the students from coming out. It furled them. The following day, on May 4th, hundreds of students gathered at Kent State University to protest once more. Under the instruction of the governor, the Ohio State National Guard was also there, armed and ready. The protests swelled with tension, and the officers ended up using tear gas to send the students away. But that failed. Refusing to go, the students threw rocks at the guards and chaos took over. What happened next is one of the most tragic events to happen at an anti-war protest in the history of modern America. By noon, the National Guard opened fire on the students. For 13 painful seconds, they shot at unarmed students, killing 4 students and leaving 9 others wounded. Students ran off in every direction, screaming at the top of their voices. The event had happened in broad daylight, and several of the witnesses were aghast that the United States government would kill its citizens in this ruthless massacre. The news of the shootings spread like a fire across the country. For the next couple of days, the protests would intensify across the country. University students walked out of their classes in solidarity with the students at Kent State University. Nationwide, there was a student strike. The divide between the government and the people had only gotten deeper. President Nixon had to address the people. However, in his address, he showed regret for the shootings. However, he never accepted full responsibility for them. He also went on to explain that his decision to expand the war into Cambodia and Laos was the right thing to do and was crucial to winning the war. With tensions on the rise, this only further incensed the people and increased the anti-war protests. But this was just the beginning of bad things to come. The following year, in 1971, a series of classified papers known as the Pentagon Papers made their way to the public. You see, for the longest time, the US presidents had told the people that the war in Vietnam was a war for freedom. They said that they fought to spread communism. However, when these papers showed up, they showed that that wasn't the whole truth. As though the Cambodia and Laos bombings weren't enough betrayal, the American people were witnessing and having to deal with yet another one. All of this happened because of one man, his name, Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg was a defense strategist and a former military analyst. He worked at the Rand Corporation and had access to top-secret files. These files contained the history of the United States' involvement in Vietnam as far back as 1940. When Daniel Ellsberg read through these documents, he was shocked and decided that he was going to expose the truth. This was a very dangerous thing to do, but he believed that US citizens deserved to know the truth about what the US government was doing. The Pentagon Papers were a 7,000-page document. It was titled Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. It was a detailed and comprehensive study that showed how successive presidents and administrations had lied to the US citizens about the war. This document showed how the US government had long secretly expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia without informing either the United States Congress or the American public. It also showed that the military already knew for a long time that it was impossible for them to win this war, even before Richard Nixon suggested withdrawing the troops. Daniel Ellsberg was horrified about this information and took the risk of copying these top-secret files and leaking them to the press, starting with the New York Times. On the 13th of June, 1971, the New York Times began to publish a series of articles that detailed all the horrifying revelations. Everyone was shocked by the headlines and found it hard to believe the government had been lying to them the entire time. When Richard Nixon heard of it, he panicked. The document was focused on exposing the decisions of former presidents, but he was worried that the Pentagon Papers would only break what was left of the trust the people had in the government. The anti-war protests were across the country, and he feared that if the people saw these, it would only worsen, so he took action. The government went to court and filed an injunction to stop the New York Times from continuing to publish the articles. But this was only the beginning. Ellsberg then leaked the papers to other newspapers like the Washington Post and St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and soon enough, every popular newspaper across the country was featuring news on the Pentagon Papers on their front pages. The American people across the country got to read the publications. President Nixon and his administration took the case to court in a legal battle that was essentially the government versus the press. But the government wasn't just against the press. Soon enough, they found out that Daniel Ellsberg was the one responsible for the leak.
Even if the FBI had wanted to arrest him outside the courthouse this morning, they probably couldn't have done it.
He was arrested and charged with conspiracy, theft, and violation of the Espionage Act. All his charges were going to cost him over 100 years in prison. It was a high-profile case, and it soon reached the Supreme Court. However, on the 30th of June, 1971, the court ruled in favor of the New York Times and other newspapers involved. They allowed them to continue to publish the Pentagon Papers, stating that the press had this right under the First Amendment. Justice Hugo Black declared that the press was to serve the governed and not the governors. 2 years later, in 1973, Daniel Ellsberg also got his victory. During the trial, it was revealed that President Nixon and members of his government had used illegal means to get their evidence. They even went as far as breaking into his psychiatrist's office to steal confidential files. The charges raised against him eventually got dismissed. Thanks to his bravery, Ellsberg became a nationwide hero, celebrated for resisting the U.S. government's attempts to keep their criminal actions a secret. The papers he released caused the people to lose whatever trust they had left in the government. They even began to question the legitimacy of the war. They feared that the war was based on lies, and that it should be ended. The media also began to dig up more information about how the United States had handled the Vietnam conflicts, and consequently, anti-war protests proliferated. President Nixon had lost both battles. It didn't matter that the papers mostly revealed what previous administrations had done. His attempt to have it suppressed, combined with his secret bombing of Laos and Cambodia, only left the people wary of the trustworthiness of his character. For him, this was the beginning of the end. Aside from all that was going wrong at home, Richard Nixon was quickly realizing that things were also going wrong back at the war. After spending years relentlessly bombing Laos and Cambodia, it was becoming clear that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army were tougher than they'd imagined. Now, with mounting protests, President Richard Nixon and his administration had to find a diplomatic way to end this bloody war. However, this wasn't the first time they were exploring diplomatic means. You see, the United States had tried diplomatic negotiations since 1968, when the outrage against the war began. They held peace talks in Paris, but the debated negotiations failed to result in anything profitable. If you wonder why, the reason is quite basic, that both sides didn't want the same thing. The United States and the South Vietnamese leaders wanted South Vietnam to remain independent without North Vietnam. Essentially, they wanted things to remain as they were, with both sides divided along the 17th parallel. North Vietnam, on the other hand, now led by Ho Chi Minh's successors, wanted the whole of Vietnam to be united under communist rule. There was no middle ground, so the war was perpetuated. By 1972, the United States had spent so much money bombing, meanwhile also losing many men. The international community was also opposed to their determinations. On the other hand, while the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were relentless, they were starting to feel the toll of the bombing, having lost a great number of soldiers. They were starting to crack and wanted to strike a deal of peace without having to give up their position, the very crux of the contention. But the United States would have none of it. You see, the man who was in charge of the peace talks, Henry Kissinger, was also Nixon's national security advisor.
What he hopes will be the final phase of the negotiations to end the war in Indochina.
He would go on to eventually become Secretary of State. He had a heavy burden on his shoulders. The burden was the work of bringing North Vietnam to the negotiating table. It was a daunting task for which he had to use both diplomatic and military means. By late 1972, another attempt failed, and it seemed like the plan to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't working. So he went on and devised a different plan. The goal of this plan was to force North Vietnam to the negotiation table by intensifying pressure. the United States would launch a full-scale air attack on North Vietnam, especially in major cities such as Haiphong and Hanoi. They would also do it during the Christmas holidays, similar to what they had done during TET. This operation was known as Operation Linebacker 2, but it was eventually renamed or popularized as the Christmas bombings. With this new set of bombings, he hoped to pass a message. This message was either come to the table or continue to face intense destruction. From December 18th to December 29th of 1972, North Vietnam faced 12 days of intense bombings. The United States dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. They bombed the capital city, Hanoi, and the major port city, Haiphong.
And all of a sudden, around Christmas time, we hear an arc light operation.
As Kissinger suggested, they bombed railways, factories, power plants, and military bases. Residential areas were also bombed, leading to North Vietnam losing hundreds of people. The bombing was relentless. Both day and night, waves of B-52 bombers dropped bombs on the city. As the North Vietnam leaders did during the TET offensive, Henry Kissinger and his president, Richard Nixon, hoped that they would win the psychological war, that a large amount of destruction would force North Vietnam to the negotiation table. But despite these bombings, North Vietnam didn't give in. In fact, the leader of the party, Le Duan, declared that they were not going to be intimidated by these bombings. But this false bravado was only superficial. Behind closed doors, everything was different. The bombings had been both devastatingly catastrophic, as strategic locations and infrastructure were the targets. Countless structures in Vietnam were destroyed, including their military bases. Several Vietnamese had been killed and rendered homeless. Families were torn apart. The city could not function for as long as the bombings continued. Henry Kissinger knew this, and it was why, despite the show of bravery the Vietnamese leaders were putting on, he wasn't moved. He was certain the Christmas bombings would work because of how damaging they were. He was sure that even though they were resilient, they wouldn't be able to stand such a large-scale attack and would eventually have to negotiate. Secretly, the leaders considered their options. Should they give in and end this torture, or were they to remain resilient as they had always been? By the time the bombing ceased, they'd have come to a realization. The United States was willing to do anything to force them to negotiate. That if they continued to hold their fort, the consequences may be their very end. They had barely survived, but the cities and their infrastructure had been completely destroyed. So, on the 30th of December, they signified their willingness to come to the negotiation table. Henry Kissinger had succeeded. Despite the damage done to U.S. reputation and the scar left on North Vietnam, he considered the bombings to be a great success. However, bringing North Vietnam to the negotiation table was only part of the problem. To achieve peace via diplomacy, they were still going to have to jump over several hurdles. One of those hurdles was the fact that both sides wanted different things. The South Vietnamese president, President Nguyen Van Thieu, was still 100% against accepting any deal that would leave North Vietnamese forces, including the Viet Cong in the south. He believed that kind of peace was a ticking time bomb and would only give room for them to take over once no one was watching. North Vietnamese leaders led by Le Duc Tho, their chief negotiator, on the other hand, insisted that before they would even make any agreements, the United States had to withdraw all its troops. Kissinger had his work cut out for him, but after years of a dragged-out war and failed negotiations, he finally managed to bring the United States, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam into a peace agreement on the 27th of January, 1973.
I am confident that we will soon achieve that goal.
Which became known as the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement was supposed to bring peace to Vietnam and stop the war. There were several key points to this peace agreement. Firstly, they agreed that all American prisoners held by North Vietnam would be released. Secondly, there would be a ceasefire between North and South Vietnam to bring an end to the war immediately. Thirdly, both sides would no longer send any troops into the other's territories, including supplies. They also set up a joint commission to monitor this and ensure this agreement was followed to the letter. Fourthly, the United States would withdraw her troops and all her military personnel from Vietnam within 60 days. Furthermore, they would maintain the 17th parallel, which was the initial division of North and South Vietnam. Once again, they agreed that the future of the country would be determined through free and fair elections. Lastly, the agreement allowed that the United States would continue to support South Vietnam and allow them to build their military even after the U.S. troops had withdrawn. The United States was happy with this agreement. For them, the Paris Peace Accord was the most honorable way to leave this war. President Richard Nixon saw it as the best way to achieve peace with honor. To leave without admitting defeat and even claim a diplomatic victory. As agreed, the United States started to withdraw all of its troops left in Vietnam. And by March of 1973, they had removed all of their soldiers. The only military men left on South Vietnamese soil were military advisors to advise the ARVN. The withdrawal was a highlight of the organized process. For 2 months, American soldiers returned daily, both via ships and helicopters. While this was a sigh of relief for most Americans as they could now finally close the chapter, it was the beginning of sheer anxiety for South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese army was still very unprepared for any battle, and now that America had withdrawn its troops, they were struggling to control and protect their territories. This was because North Vietnam hadn't completely given up as they had pretended to be. You see, they agreed to the ceasefire, but they knew that the US was done with the war and that they would no longer intervene in Vietnam. So even though they didn't attack, they continued to push their advantage in strategic areas of South Vietnam, and several skirmishes continued in the rural areas. The peace accord had only helped Kissinger and Nixon fulfill their goal of peace with honor. However, for Vietnam, there wasn't a guarantee of peace, even though for everyone outside, it looked like there was. Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, who had negotiated the Paris Peace Accord, were nominated as recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts that year.
Allow me, sir, now to present you with the visible and tangible token of the Peace Prize, the Wartlock Peace Prize for 1974. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much.
However, Le Duc Tho would refuse to accept the prize, his decision based on the fact that there was still conflict in Vietnam, and the Paris Peace Accord hadn't brought total peace in the region. And he was right, because without American troops on the ground, the South Vietnamese were rendered vulnerable. North Vietnam was relentless. It was the case of a reckless time bomb left to explode. With the United States gone, South Vietnam had to stand on its own. However, the South Vietnamese government was fragile, and its military was still as weak as it had always been. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong continued to cause small bouts of chaos in the rural south until it became very clear that it was no longer a question if North Vietnamese forces would attack South Vietnam. It had become a question of when. In North Vietnam, even though Ho Chí Minh had died in September 1969, General Vo Nguyen Giap was still in control. The political arm of government was now led by Lê Duan. General Giap saw a major chance to achieve their dream of a unified Vietnam. Peace. Accord or not, the United States were finally out of the picture, which left them with only South Vietnam to deal with. He expected it to be easy because not only was South Vietnam militarily weak, they were also unstable, both politically and economically. Despite the Paris Peace Accord, they never had plans of letting South Vietnam remain a separate state forever, and they knew that the South wouldn't allow the election to hold ever. So he and his men began to plan. They knew that without the US troops, they outright outmatched the ARVN. All they needed was one good final push to achieve their goal. And they'd make that effort. That final push would become known as the Ho Chí Minh Campaign in honor of their late leader. General Giap's plan for this final campaign was simple. They were to come with overwhelming force and take advantage of South Vietnamese weak defenses. With this force, they'd be able to capture major cities before the ARVN could ever come up with a plan. The best part? With the peace accord signed, he knew the United States would not intervene. They soon began moving troops towards South Vietnam. In March 1975, they finally attacked, and the Ho Chí Minh Campaign officially began in Buon Ma Thuot, which was in the central highlands of South Vietnam. General Giap believed that if North Vietnamese forces could take control of the central highlands, they would be able to divide South Vietnam in half. This way, they would then be able to cut off supply lines, hence bringing the rest of South Vietnam to its knees, so they moved quickly. They launched a surprise attack on Buon Ma Thuot as planned. They used overwhelming force and, as expected, were able to overpower the ARVN soldiers in Buon Ma Thuot. And in less than 1 week, they had captured the city. South Vietnam was sent into chaos. President Nguyen Van Thieu was unsure what to do. He didn't have a strong military, and there was pressure to act as fast as a reflex. He then made a costly decision to pull back his troops from both the Central Highlands and some northern regions and bring them to strengthen the defenses in the south. This implied that he'd be abandoning major cities, including the city of Hue, leaving them defenseless. This decision would go on to be called the strategic withdrawal. Once he made this decision, everything started to worsen at a much more rapid pace. As the troops pulled out, the people were thrown into panic. They fled the cities, blocking the roads. The South Vietnamese troops were not organized and were further disconcerted by the people's mass exodus. Their retreat was very chaotic. Satisfied with this result, General Giap and his troops marched forward. With the South Vietnamese soldiers retreating further, they easily began capturing city after city. They experienced negligible resistance as they moved on, and this only further strengthened them. The Ho Chí Minh Campaign was moving very fast. Soon enough, North Vietnamese forces were about to confidently secure the Central Highlands. After this accomplishment, next they began to aim for the coastal cities in South Vietnam. They trudged forward, and thanks to the weak South Vietnamese army, they were able to comfortably capture 2 major cities in South Vietnam, Hue and Da Nang. At this point, it was clear that South Vietnam was absolutely unable to defend itself. However, the United States looked on. Back in the United States, Nixon had resigned, and someone else had taken over the seat of power. Replacing him was President Gerald Ford. President General Ford watched as South Vietnam crumbled because somehow it was as though his hands were tied. The American people refused to entertain any thoughts of the U.S. engaging itself with Vietnam. After the unfortunate deaths during the anti-war protests, the mass casualties of the war, the horror the media revealed, were as a result of the bombings and revelations of the Pentagon Papers. He did not have a good enough reason for re-engagement. However, Ford didn't want to lose Vietnam to communism, and he was worried about the brutality dealt to the South. There was pressure on him to ensure that the United States troops did not go back to Vietnam. Confused and unsure what to do, President Ford decided to do the one thing the peace accord allowed for the United States to do: offer aid to South Vietnam. However, things took a sad turn when he presented a plea for additional military aid for South Vietnam to the U.S. Congress. Members of Congress refused and instead further slashed the funding, leaving South Vietnam even worse off.
This is another of the tragedies. For just a relatively small additional commitment in economic and military aid.
After the fall of Da Nang and several other cities, there was nothing stopping General Giap and his forces from heading to Saigon, South Vietnam's capital. They marched forward, defeating any defenses from the ARVN as they went ahead. By April 1975, they were already on the outskirts of Saigon. President Thieu reckoned to himself that the end was near. Refusing to wait for it, he resigned and fled the country, leaving South Vietnam in disarray. What was left of the government struggled to organize a defense and protect the capital. But it was clear, however, that it was all a waste of time, even if they tried their best. With the North Vietnamese forces closing in on their victory over South Vietnam, President Ford had the shortest time to act if he was to save anything.
President Gerald Ford ordered all U.S. troops and citizens out of the country.
Permit the movement of refugees to the area of their choice.
The United States Embassy in South Vietnam hurried to evacuate all American personnel and allies left in South Vietnam. Their government sent helicopters to airlift thousands of people out of Saigon as the North Vietnamese troops inched closer. Members of the U.S. military who were left hopped onto the last flights. By April 29th, the North Vietnamese army began attacking Saigon. They rolled tanks and fired heavy artillery into Saigon, breaking what was left of the city's defenses. The remaining forces of the ARVN, who were left standing, struggled to put up a resistance, but it was pointless now. Not only were they outgunned, but they were also outnumbered. Civilians who were left in the city, realizing they wouldn't be safe, ran to the United States Embassy, hoping to escape in last fights. The following day, on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese forces made their way into Saigon. They headed to the presidential palace. Those who were left of South Vietnam's government surrendered unconditionally.
And from which General Minh has today announced that he will unconditionally hand over to the new regime.
Saigon had fallen. Once Saigon fell, the Republic of South Vietnam was over. The North Vietnamese people were happy. This was a long-awaited victory. They had waited for ages to unite Vietnam under communism, and now it was finally going to happen. However, it would not be easy. The war had gone on for long, and the scars were deep. Also, the South was very uncertain about unification. They'd been conquered, but they'd not stopped believing in being a separate state. Nonetheless, the North took weighted steps towards unifying the whole country. They began the process of reunifying Vietnam, both politically, socially, and economically. Firstly, they ended the divide. There was no more South or North. There was just the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam was united under the leadership of the Communist Party. The Communist Party had the job of leading the unification process. The man on whom they assigned to head this task was none other than Le Duan. He was the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam and oversaw the unification transition. He had been a major player in the war efforts and political rule of the country, especially after the death of Ho Chí Minh. Le Duan didn't just want to unite the South and the North. He wanted to also transform the South and make it into a state that also believed in the communist ideologies of the North. So he and his government introduced a set of policies that would change the political and economic structure of the South. The first thing they did was land reforms. They nationalized the agricultural industry and made it a collective state effort. They wanted to stop the capitalist systems in the South. Therefore, nationalizing the agricultural industry was one of the fastest ways to do it. While most of the poor were happy about these changes, several more in the South weren't. They had spent several years fighting against communism and were staunch capitalists. They felt forced by Le Duan and his government to practice communism. So, they formed a small group and started something resembling a resistance. However, Le Duan was smart. He expected that this was likely to happen, so he acted quickly. One of the few things he did to curb this was the creation of the re-education camps. However, the people of South Vietnam were opposed to the creation of those camps. They hated it and saw it as oppressive. Le Duan created these camps to indoctrinate former South Vietnamese soldiers and officials, including civilians, whom he saw as threats to his new rule. If anyone was suspected of being staunchly anti-communist, they were sent to these camps. Thousands of people were eventually sent to these camps. The people sent to these camps were getting indoctrinated into communism while being forced to do hard labor and bear harsh treatment. It was worse than prison. Some of them got released on time back into society after a few months, while some others spent years locked away in these camps. Several died from the situation in these camps. Many of those who fought for South Vietnam during the war were punished. Le Duan's regime ensured that they were silenced to prevent them from growing into bigger problems. Le Duan knew that if he was to put an end to the skirmishes and many protests against his rule and communist rule, the camps couldn't be enough. He also needed to have a strong military presence to maintain control. He made sure that North Vietnamese troops and several locally trained militias were stationed around South Vietnam. The job of these troops was to enforce the new communist laws and policies and ensure anyone who went against them faced the consequences. Le Duan didn't just focus on his enemies. He also focused on rebuilding the infrastructure Vietnam had lost during the war. He rebuilt schools, hospitals, roads, and bridges across Vietnam as a way of unifying the country. He also tried to use propaganda to unify the nation ideologically. However, it didn't seem like it was working. Many in the South didn't want his ideology, and they faced the consequences. They had their businesses seized and closed down, relatives locked away in re-education camps, livelihoods destroyed, and many of them were left destitute. Thousands of them found Le Duan and his communist reign intolerable. Their future seemed bleak if they remained in Vietnam, and so, having no choice, they decided to flee. These fleeing groups were eventually known as the Boat People. Thousands of South Vietnamese refugees fled through the sea, risking their lives trying to cross the South China Sea to neighboring countries like Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia. It was a huge risk because several of these boats were unsafe and rickety, yet the people risked their lives. It grew into a major crisis as more and more refugees fled Vietnam, traversing over the sea in desperate measures. Many of them died in the sea because the boats were unsafe. Many others died from the sea's treacherous waves, from falling to pirate attacks, and from diseases or hunger and malnourishment. Over 1 million of them fled, and estimatedly half of that population died in the sea. Countries around the world had to open their doors due to the numbers. These countries included Australia, Canada, and the United States. They helped resettle those who were able to make it out alive, unable to stop the humanitarian disaster from happening. However, Le Duan didn't seem bothered by this great exodus. It only strengthened him to further unify the state, and he took one further step in that direction. He went on to rename Saigon as Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the northern leader who had championed their fight for independence and unity. He hoped that this would tell the people of South Vietnam that this was the end of the old regime and now they were to celebrate their unity. However, those in the South saw it as an insult and a bitter reminder that they had lost their country to the communists. They struggled to adapt to this new system, while Le Duan did his best to maintain control and implement his vision. Even though North and South had been officially reunited physically, they were still very much divided at heart. But the refugees weren't the only consequence of the war. The war had been devastating, lasting over 2 painful decades, and had come at an extreme cost. One of the highest costs was the human cost. The Vietnam War cost the lives of over 3 million people, most of whom were the Vietnamese themselves. About 2 million of them were ordinary civilians caught in the crossfire and bombings across the country. Both the North and South military lost more than 1 million soldiers. The United States had lost over 58,000 members of its force, and while it was a terrible blow to them, it was not comparable to the woes and losses of the Vietnamese. The costs had also been economical. No thanks to the bombings, Vietnam's agriculture came to a halt. One of the saddest stories is of one of the rice paddies at Mekong Delta. The rice paddies at the Mekong Delta that had once been highly prosperous were, by the end of the war, covered with explosives that had yet to explode and made them dangerous to farm in. Several Vietnamese cities had been reduced to rubble and their industries destroyed. But it wasn't just about what was destroyed. It was the consequences of the destruction. For years after the war, Vietnam struggled with food shortages. Their agriculture couldn't sustain them, and their economy was in ruins. There were no meaningful commercial trades during the war, so inflation was at sky-high levels. Le Duan and his government tried to collectivize agriculture in South Vietnam to solve this problem, but the South Vietnamese resisted this move. Even when he tried forcefully, the results weren't great. In fact, they only worsened the already bad economic situation. With no choice, Le Duan turned to China and the Soviet Union for help. They assisted the best they could, but it still wasn't enough. Several of the Southerners fearing Le Duan and his rule became refugees after risking their lives to cross the South China Sea. Those who stayed behind were imprisoned in re-education camps. But one of the most saddening parts of the war was the fate of American prisoners of war and those who were MIA. During the war, over 500 American soldiers were taken to prisons by North Vietnam. These soldiers were held in terrible conditions in prisoner camps in Hanoi. Several U.S. pilots were held in these camps. Even though most of these prisoners were released in 1973 as part of the agreement of the Paris Peace Accord, the issue of those missing in action still remained. For years after the war, several families waited, hoping one day that their relatives who had gone to fight the war would be found. Till date, over 1,000 soldiers are still reported missing in Vietnam. But even those who survived the war still felt the pain. Even though they made it back home, they weren't given the hero's welcome that other soldiers were given.
When I came home, I was subject to a lot of ridicule, verbal abuse.
Most of the American veterans from the Vietnam War returned to a country where the anti-war cry had cast a shadow on their services, and their sacrifice was not appreciated. Several of them had to deal with trauma and PTSD. Several of the tunnel rats returned claustrophobic, and with several other mental issues. They had to deal with this in silence because not only were treatment options not available, but the society they lived in didn't seem to appreciate the war they had fought in. The human costs of the war had been devastating. In Washington, D.C., the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a quiet reminder of how many American soldiers were lost to the war. There are 58,000 names etched in the granite as a remembrance of their sacrifice. Nonetheless, the war had shown the resilience of the Vietnamese people towards gaining their independence and unity. But how did this war affect the rest of the world? On a global scale, the Vietnam War wasn't just a war in Southeast Asia. It was the battleground for the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. For several years, America's foreign policy was focused on containing the spread of communism. The domino theory, which had first started with President Eisenhower, was the fear that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, the rest would also follow. Eisenhower and the presidents after him fought in Vietnam, believing that if they could stop communism in Vietnam, they could stop it from spreading on the continent. They were right because as soon as Saigon fell in 1975, the other states outside Vietnam soon began to fall to communism. Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, backed by the Soviet Union and China, soon brought Cambodia to communist rule. This rule went on to commit one of the worst human rights tragedies in the 20th century by mass executing over 1 million people to achieve his goal of collective agriculture. Laos also fell to communist rule, and the region slowly became what the United States had forced to prevent. But the Vietnam War also forced the United States to take another look at her foreign policy. The first change came in 1973 with the War Powers Act. This legislation was created to prevent the president from sending the U.S. military into war without the Congress giving its consent. This was because of the secret bombings ordered by President Nixon. There was also a growing desire in the United States to prevent ever involving itself in another long and costly war. The act also set limits on how long the United States troops could be sent abroad without the approval of Congress. Aside from that, the United States military also started to prepare for war with an enemy who used guerrilla-style tactics. Their initial strategies had failed against the guerrilla fighters of North Vietnam, and so they started to emphasize studying how to counter insurgency and understand local territories before a war. This also shaped the style of American operations, especially those in the Middle East, where they also had to fight insurgency once more. However, Southeast Asia had to deal with the long-lasting effects of the war. Not just Vietnam, but also Cambodia and Laos. They all had unexploded ordnances that prevented them from ever using parts of their land. It was a long war that left deep scars. In the end, the war was a fight for the independence and unification of Vietnam. Today's Vietnam has long risen from the devastation of the war. However, the war changed the course of Vietnamese history, and its story would echo in history for years to come.